The Secret Garden. I see and hear everything. Whether I'm perched atop the oak tree, waiting at the kitchen window for some tasty crumbs, or sitting on the handle of Ben the gardener's spade, there's nothing I do not know about Misselthwaite Manor and the family that live there. When you're a Robin Redbreast, everyone wants to be your friend, so it's impossible not to become involved. And let me tell you, an awful lot has been going on. It has been a bitterly cold winter. A deep layer of snow has blanketed everything since Christmas Day. This makes food hard to find, so I've been most grateful for the nuts and crusts that Cookie has left for me on the kitchen windowsill. That's when I first heard her muttering about Mary, the new addition to the family.
"I don't care what anyone else says, she's a right little monster," said Cookie. "I know she lost her parents and is new to this country, but that doesn't mean she can behave in that way. Besides, she doesn't like my porridge for breakfast, so there must be something very wrong with her. Very wrong indeed."
Now I knew that Misselthwaite Manor had a new arrival. I saw Jackson the driver come from the station a week before Christmas with a sullen little girl carrying one tiny suitcase. So that must be the Mary that Cookie was talking about. I decided to investigate further, so after filling my belly with food from the windowsill, I flew off to discover more about our mysterious new guest. I passed, as usual, the windows of young Master Colin's bedroom. There he sat, as always, in his wheelchair, gazing out across the gardens. I landed on his windowsill and took a closer look. Poor Colin. In all my time at the manor, I'd never seen him leave his room, let alone walk. It always filled me with sorrow to see him this way. His mother, Lillian, died when he was still young, and his heartbroken father was so scared of anything bad happening to him that he never let Colin leave the house. After a while, Cookie started taking his food up to him, so he had no reason to leave his room. The last and saddest step came when Colin's father bought that wheelchair. He thought that Colin was too weak to walk, and the chair would keep him safe from harm. When Lillian, Colin's mother, was alive, the manor had been a home filled with love and laughter. There was always something wonderful happening. Summer parties, vast family gatherings, glamorous balls, lovely picnics, expeditions into the countryside, and garden fetes. But after Lillian passed away, the house fell silent. No one visited anymore, and Colin's father spent all of his time at work. As I swooped over Ben the gardener, digging away at the flower beds, I passed one of the larger windows at the back of the manor house and saw her. Mary was in the middle of a loud argument with the fierce governess, Mrs. Medlock, when she suddenly burst into tears. "Mrs. Medlock, I just want to go back to India and be with my mummy and daddy." Mrs. Medlock shook her head sadly. "My dear Mary, your parents are now in heaven, and this is your home." Mary sat on the bed and wiped her eyes on her sleeve. Mrs. Medlock continued. "I know it's very different here to India, but the manor and the surrounding countryside is very beautiful. Why don't you have a bath, put some clothes on, and come down for some breakfast? Once you've eaten, you can start exploring." Mary nodded sadly and did as she was told. Watching her eat her breakfast, I knew what I could do to help. Over the next few weeks, Mary slowly began to enjoy living there. Most of the time she was polite and happy, but every now and then I could see her overcome with sadness. Once, when Mary was sitting, crying by the kitchen window, I landed on the windowsill and caught her attention. She blinked away her tears as she watched me. I looked her in the eye and then flew off. Then I flew back to the windowsill. After a while, Mary seemed to understand that I wanted her to follow me. She quickly put on her warmest coat, gloves and hat, and then ran after me across the snowy lawns. Hidden behind the ivy-covered wall at the end of the orchard was the secret garden. It was a beautiful place that Colin's mother Lillian had created when she first arrived at the manor. There was a tinkling fountain that fed a pond full of gleaming, swirling goldfish, an abundance of bluebells, tulips and daffodils that burst forth every spring. Throughout the summer, dozens of red, white and yellow rose bushes filled the air with their sweet perfume. There were dahlias and camellias, forget-me-nots and pansies. Everywhere was full of life. Mary followed me around the side of the house, down through the orchard and onto the wall that surrounded the garden. Then I realized that as a bird, I could just fly right in, but she would need the key to unlock the stout wooden door. Mary tried the old brass handle, but it didn't budge. I knew the key was sitting on the top shelf of the bookcase in Colin's room. I fluttered behind Mary as she trudged back through the snow to the manor. How could I help her find the key? Then, as she opened the front door, I knew what I had to do. I flew into the house, landed on the staircase, and whistled to her to follow me. Mary gasped when she saw me, and then burst into laughter. I circled around her head and then flew up 3 flights of stairs to the very top of the house. Mary ran after me, giggling and catching her breath at the top of each landing. At the very top of the house, I landed on the doorknob of Colin's door, whistled at Mary again, and then pecked as hard as I could on the door. Mary almost jumped out of her skin when she heard his voice coming from inside. "Who is it? Who's there?" he said weakly. She looked at me with her wide eyes before clearing her throat and answering. "My name is Mary Lennox. Who are you, by the way?" Suddenly the door swung open to reveal Colin in his wheelchair. Both children stared at each other in stunned silence before exploding with questions. "Who are you? Why are you here? How long have you been here? Are we related? Why can't you walk? Is that your Robin? Why have I never seen you before?" Talking non-stop, the 2 children moved into Colin's large room and tried to untangle each other's questions and make sense of how they both came to live in the same house without even knowing the other one was there. Suddenly Mary called out, "The Robin! The Robin led me here. Where is he?" I had been standing waiting patiently on the bookcase next to the large old brass key. Mary spied the heavy old key and knew exactly which door it would unlock. "Colin, please may I borrow this key?" she asked excitedly. Colin stared at it silently, blinking back the tears in his eyes. "I found it in my mother's room just after she died. My father let me keep it if I promised to never leave this room." "But why?" "Well, in case something bad or dangerous happened to me. Why do you need it?" Mary explained how I had led her to the door of the secret garden, and how she was convinced that it would open the door. "I promise to return it to you tomorrow, cross my heart," Mary said, clutching the key to her chest. Colin finally agreed, but before he could say anything else to her, Mary raced down the stairs and flew out the front door. Well, I'm sure you can guess what happened next. Mary raced towards the secret garden, placed the key in the lock and turned it. The hinges squeaked as the door swung open, and Mary stepped inside. It looked untidy, of course, tangled and overgrown, but for the first time since arriving at Misselthwaite Hall, Mary knew she was where she belonged. Every day after that, she borrowed Colin's key early in the morning, spent the day working in the secret garden, and then returned the key after dinner. As spring turned to summer, Mrs. Medlock saw the change in Mary, and it warmed her heart to see her blossom and grow. The best part of Colin's day was after dinner listening to Mary's garden news. Each evening she told him what she'd done, about how she'd cleaned the pond, weeded the flower beds, sowed new seeds, pruned the flowers and shrubs, and put out food for the birds, squirrels, and hedgehogs. Each night she went to bed tired and weary, but with a growing sense of happiness. Every time Mary stepped into the secret garden, she seemed to know exactly what needed to be done to bring the garden back to life. One night, after hearing Mary's description of how the garden seemed to be growing before her very eyes, Colin sighed. He wished he could see it. "Of course you can see it. Come with me bright and early tomorrow morning," said Mary. "But I can't walk," said Colin. "It will be impossible for me to get my wheelchair down all those stairs. Besides," he said quietly, "I promised my father I would never leave this room in case something bad happened to me." "Nothing bad is going to happen to you in the secret garden," smiled Mary. "I have an idea. You just make sure you're ready early tomorrow morning when I come to get you." Colin wasn't sure about Mary's plan, but finally agreed. Early the next morning, Mary knocked softly on his door. Colin opened it immediately, but his face dropped when he saw that Mary had nothing with her but a beaming smile on her face. "Ready?" she whispered. "Good. Now jump on my back and I'll give you a piggyback to the garden." Colin shook his head and grinned. What? You'll never be able to carry me all that way." He laughed. "Ha," said Mary. "I'll show you." So Colin clambered awkwardly out of his wheelchair and onto Mary's back. Before he knew it, they were down the stairs and out the front door. I was perched above the front door, and as soon as I saw them, I gave them the all-clear whistle and then flew ahead of them to make sure the path was clear. I could hear Colin laughing and whooping as Mary carried him along. She turned the key in the lock, swung open the door, and I watched Colin's face as he entered the secret garden for the first time. Colin had never even imagined that such a wonderful place could exist. Mary sat him on the bench, and he watched the tinkling fountain as it gurgled cool, clear water into the silent pond. He gazed at the endless flower blossoms of every shape and colour that filled the air with their sweet fragrances. Butterflies danced lazily in the warm morning air, and a pair of frogs croaked contentedly from beneath their lily pads. All manner of birds, sparrows, turtle doves, finches, blackbirds and jays, swooped and called from the branches of the elm, elder, birch and oak trees that bordered the garden. As I perched on the arm of the bench, I heard Colin whisper, "This is the most beautiful place I've ever seen." Mary beamed with pride and delight. Colin understood what she had known all along. "Do you feel it, Colin? Do you feel how special this place is? It's as if this garden has a power all of its own," said Mary. Colin knew exactly what Mary meant. He could feel something here that he hadn't felt for such a long time, a mix of hope, joy and happiness that made him almost dizzy with delight. Suddenly Colin knew what he was going to do. He knew what he had to do. He stood up. Mary gasped. "You can do it, Colin. You can do it. The secret garden will help you. Come on, walk to me," exclaimed Mary. Colin took a small wobbly step and then another, carefully and gently putting one foot ahead of the other until he walked the full length of the garden and fell into Mary's arms. Their joyous laughter and shouts of delight filled the garden. Suddenly there was a very loud hammering on the door. "Colin? Mary? Is that you?" shouted Mrs. Medlock. "Open up at once. Where are you? This is outrageous." Mary ran and opened the door, and in rushed Mrs. Medlock, followed by Ben the gardener and Cookie. "What on earth is going on? What—" Mrs. Medlock suddenly stopped and stared around her. The looks of anger and worry on their faces turned to confusion as they took in their amazing surroundings. "Colin!" shrieked Mrs. Medlock suddenly. "Here you are! Why aren't you in bed? What? Mary took Mrs. Medlock's hands in hers and called to Colin. "Colin, please show them the magic." Colin grinned at them as he slowly but steadily walked over to them. Well, Mrs. Medlock and Cookie nearly fainted at the sight of Colin walking, while Ben kept opening and closing his mouth, but no words came out. That was the day that everything changed at Misselthwaite Manor. Colin's father rushed back from his travels as soon as he heard the news. He couldn't wait to see his son walk with his own eyes. That summer they spent every day together in the secret garden as a family. The air was filled with laughter and happiness. The magic of the garden seemed to fill the house with warmth and light too. I spent the rest of that summer keeping an eye on Colin and Mary, and I watched them become the very best of friends. I know this much. The secret garden will be their favourite garden for the rest of their lives.